Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Rachel Ann from the Mickey Hart Book Club, and I'm so excited to be here with all of you. One of the first things I would really like to thank the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation because you have been an incredible partner to work with on this book. You know, it's often we'll get the author of a book to come by or other things, you know, as we're doing our final meeting, but you have been engaged the whole time. You've provided some incredible assets and opportunities for people to learn and really engage with you, and I'm so grateful. So it's been an absolute pleasure to pick this book and work with you guys, and I'm so excited to be here. So again, thank you. And I'm joined today by my co-host, Dennis Liu, who is from the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation, and he will introduce his colleagues that are here with us today. So he'll be my co-host. And basically today we're going to go through some questions that we have for you already and give their team a chance to talk about the work that they're doing together while we get to listen in, which is very exciting, being a fly on their wall. Huh, no pun intended. Fly on your wall, huh? Tough crowd today. And then we're going to open it up so you guys can ask some questions. I know some of you had submitted questions via the internet. You can put your questions in the chat. And Dennis, welcome. Welcome, Peter. Welcome, Paula, Chris, everyone. Hi, good morning.
Hello. Good morning. Hi, Rachel Ann. Good to see you again.
Yes. Dennis, I'm going to turn it over to you while I work on this little Facebook issue.
Yeah,
so
that's great.
I'm here, but I'm going to look at some technical stuff for us. I will be right back.
Well, welcome to the sort of the culminating episode in this book club. Really appreciate everyone participating in this, and just want to remind everyone, really, we want to be able to answer your questions. So please, put your questions up on Facebook or put them in the chat. We've, of course, prepared some things. We've got a panel full of talkers, so it won't be any problem for us to fill the hour, but we'd really like to know what your questions, but also what you think about things. So I'm Dennis Liu. I'm the Vice President of Education for the Foundation. So some of you may have met me before in a previous one of these events. So I'm really about trying to bring the various messages and the mission of the foundation to educators and students of all sorts and across the planet. We do focus our work somewhat on the United States, but that's really just to get started. Let me introduce our panelists today. They're in a terrific position to talk about Half Earth, the science of Half Earth, aspects of the book, the mission of the foundation, and the Half Earth Project. And the first person I'd like to introduce is Piotr Naskrecki. How you doing, Peter?
Good. I'm great, Dennis. Good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you again as well. And I think I have to give a sort of a special shout out to Peter because he's coming to us from Mozambique. He's coming to us from Gorongosa National Park in Sofala province. It's a pretty remote place. It's just a little after 8 p.m. there. Is that right, Peter?
Yes, it's about 8 now.
So just as a brief introduction to Peter, Peter is a co-director of the E.O. Wilson Lab in Gorongosa National Park. Science is extremely important to Gorongosa National Park. Peter is an entomologist by training. He's an amazing photographer. Ed Wilson has called him one of the greatest naturalists of our time. Peter has lots of great stories and great insights, and I'm sure we're going to get to some of those things. And we also are joined, and I also need to mention that Peter is our inaugural Half Earth Chair, which means we're supporting the foundation is supporting some of his work in Gorongosa and helping to build a network of biodiversity scientists around the planet. Next, I'd like to introduce Walter Jetz. Hi, Walter. I'm not seeing you up on my screen. I think it's just the order of the gallery here. Are you there, Walter?
I'm here. Great to see you.
Oh, yeah, there you are, Walter. Great to see you. Hey, the beard's growing in nicely. Well, Walter is another person who's a little bit hard to introduce in some ways. He has so many roles. So Walter is particularly important as in the leadership of our efforts to develop the Half-Earth map, which is an amazing tool, which some of you got to see Walter introduce. This is really meant to be a decision-making tool for making the kinds of conservation decisions we need to make if we're really gonna get to Half-Earth. And Walter runs an amazing team at Yale University. He's got a group of many interesting projects going on, including something called the Map of Life. I think one of the most interesting things about Walter is he's an accomplished and very broadly interested field biologist, but then he's taken this, how can we use computers and informatics? He's taken that to a really serious level to see how that sort of approach can contribute to conservation. And so, of course, we'll hear more from Walter as the discussion proceeds. And then finally, last and definitely not least, most important, is Paula Ehrlich, who is the president and CEO of the foundation. How are you doing, Paula?
Hi everyone. Great to see you here.
Yeah. Well, Paula is, I would say Paula has done an amazing job at focusing the work of the foundation across a lot of broad initiatives, but of course, probably really deserves a lot of credit for trying to take this inspirational book that we're going to talk about today and turn that into a project that can really make a difference on the ground for conservation. So Paula has really shaped the Half-Earth Project and the direction of the Half-Earth Project and pulled together a bunch of amazing talent to accomplish this. And of course, like all of us, I would say that Paula's a super fan of Ed. She's an expert at channeling some of Ed's ideas and trying to bring them to a broader public. And so I think with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Paula to just make a couple of opening remarks, and in particular to acknowledge some of the extraordinary circumstances and things that are happening in our country right now and across the world. So Paula, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for Dennis for creating that opportunity for just a moment. And thank you very much to everyone for joining us today. While we had long planned this Half-Earth Book Club event for yesterday in association with E.O. Wilson's birthday, we postponed the event until today in solidarity with the hashtag #ShutdownSTEM and hashtag #ShutdownAcademia campaigns for June 10th. Aligned with that campaign's call to action for June 10th, we paused for the day to reflect on systemic racism and really focus on education, action, and healing. And as we deepen our ongoing and with great humility, admittedly imperfect journey to understand how we can be part of the solution, we welcome a conversation with you on how we can do better. When E.O. Wilson wrote Half-Earth, he wrote about hope, not optimism. Sharing a quality with some of our greatest leaders, he wrote a book aimed at bringing out the best in people by inspiring collaboration, common purpose, and future possibilities. It takes hope to meet great challenges, and the book Half-Earth challenges us to be the best that we can hope for in facing a challenge we intend to win. And that challenge is this. It's estimated that we will lose half our planet's species by the end of the century. And if we lose those species, we'll lose the ecosystems, the intricate web of life that sustains nature and sustains us as part of nature. It's like a game of Jenga. You're never exactly sure which piece, when you pull it out, will cause the whole to collapse. And okay, maybe you're really good at Jenga, but here's the tricky thing. The game of Jenga is played with 54 wooden blocks. And our planet is made up of something more like 10 million species, and we only know and have a name for 2 million of them. Even if we try to be strategically smart about which ones it might be okay to remove. We only know 20% of the players on the field and very little about their connections with the 8 million others that are unknown. So you might say we're playing a little in the dark in our attempts to care for our planet. Half Earth is about solving that problem. E.O. Wilson's sense in this moment is that if everyone, especially young students, participates in the discovery, experiences the honor and privilege of creating and improving our understanding, that it'll be a transcendent moment for ourselves and for our planet. So hope that is grounded in cutting edge understanding of our planet is really the essence of the Half Earth Project.
Thanks, Paula. That's great. I'm wondering if this might be, given your comments about trying to understand the whole variety of species on the planet. I'm wondering if that might be an opportunity to pivot to Peter and Walter to talk a little bit about species discovery. And I don't know, Peter, maybe we start off with you to talk a little bit about your efforts to do species discovery and documentation in Gorongosa.
Sure, absolutely. Maybe I'll start with something slightly different though. And the fact that we are racing against something that not many people are aware of. We are racing not only against the loss of habitat, but we are also racing against the loss of species that we don't even know exist yet. There's a name for it. It's called centennial extinction. Centennial extinction, the name comes not from the word sentinel, but rather from a place in Ecuador called Centinela Ridge. And without getting into the details, this was the place where for the first time we were able to document that species can actually disappear before the science has even a chance to properly describe and document them. Now, we know now that the rate of species loss is about at least 1,000 times higher than during the pre-human times, which means that we might be losing species at the rate of between 10 to maybe even 20,000 species per year. At the same time, we are discovering and describing species at about the same rate. Between 15 to 20,000 species descriptions appear in scientific literature every year. So one race that we have to win is we have to significantly, by an order of magnitude, outpace the rate of species loss. Why? Because you cannot effectively protect something if you don't know it exists. And this is why we put in Gorongosa so much effort into understanding the full complexity and the full composition of our ecosystem. Because once you know what you have and where that thing is, and what is the, let's call it quote unquote value of that organism, then you can direct more conservation resources to that species or that population. If you don't know that a species exists, then you may lose it without even knowing that, obviously. So in Gorongosa, we very early on decided that we will start systematically documenting and mapping everything. And this is essentially exactly the same thing that Half Earth and Walter are doing on a global scale. We in Gorongosa essentially, just a single pixel on that map, but it's a very, very detailed pixel that contains a lot of information. And but when you zoom in on Gorongosa, we are now able to pinpoint areas in the park that are of particular importance. We have been able to identify centers of endemism in the park. We have been also able to identify points of particular species richness, and also hotspots, local hotspots of biodiversity. And hotspots in this case is understood as a combination of high species diversity or high level of endemism, and also high risk of human impact. And just to give you an example of how we use this information, we've been documenting the life of Gorongosa for the last 7 years in a very, very systematic fashion. Every year we add between 1,000 to 2,000 species to that list. Based on that information, we have been able to determine that one of the places that we should be paying a lot of attention to is the eastern part of the park. Just for those who don't know much about the physiography of Gorongosa, we are located at the very tip, the southernmost tip of the Great African Rift Valley. It's a phenomenal geological formation that has shaped ecosystem of the entire continent. This is the place from which we come from as a species. And it's also a biologically incredibly interesting place, the entire Rift Valley. We are at the very end of it. So life has been kind of channeled towards us for millions and millions of years. So we have an incredible richness of life here. And now the kind of the physical aspect. So as I was saying, the eastern flank of the Rift Valley is this beautiful calcium formation or limestone formation that is home to a lot of interesting and endemic species. We were able to show that based on the accumulation of data on the distribution of those species. And that also allowed us to present a strong argument to the government of Mozambique that that entire area should be put under additional protection. And that then in return allowed us to add to our conservancy a major area that used to be a hunting concession. And so the information we collect on the species has very real, very practical implication for conservation. And this is essentially what we are trying on the global scale with the Half Earth project, only on a much smaller scale. So you can see Gorongosa in a sense as a testing ground for the concept of Half Earth and the map of life. We do our little map of life of Gorongosa, and it turns out to be a very, very powerful and very, very useful tool for the practical aspects of conservation.
Well, thanks, Peter. I mean, that raises so many important questions. Obviously, Gorongosa, so one question is the uneven distribution of biodiversity, obviously globally, but even within what we think of as Gorongosa National Park, a single park, biodiversity is not evenly distributed. And obviously you folks there are putting an awful lot of effort into understanding the biodiversity of Gorongosa and trying to think seriously about how to conserve and restore it. So I wonder if we could pivot to Walter. Walter, what are your thoughts on trying to take, what's going on in Gorongosa and bring that to a global scale? How do you, what sort of thought processes, maybe even compromises, what has to happen to bring that to reality?
No, thank you, Dennis. And it's wonderful to listen to Piotr. In a way, we feel a little cheeky here, right? Because it's people like Piotr who are on the ground there and actually doing that really, really important work of species discovery and documentation. But then it's equally important, you could argue, to then find ways to put it all together to get at that larger picture. And I think that's what's most fascinating, I feel, about Ed's book, Half Earth, to tie it back to that again, right? Piotr rightly pointed out that it's the species that are ultimately the units that we're talking about here, and species doesn't exist in our mind until it's been discovered, right? And there's something actually deeply ethical question around that, right? With which ignorance we could continue to go about in this planet, not even knowing about the life around us and the species around us. Now, if these species as units, Ed in his book and his prior research going back to the 60s, actually, when some of his most pioneering work in this area was done, was a leader in, and still is a leader in relating that identity of species, the diversity of species, to their geographic place. And that's what this larger discipline of biogeography is about, right? And that's what Ed uses as a backdrop, if you will, as a foundation of his book. And it's this realization that, well, as you go from a small island to a larger and larger island, the numbers of species increase. Or indeed, as you go from a large forest fragment to a small forest fragment, the number of species decreases. And it served as an incredibly powerful model, sort of first articulated in the 60s by Ed, and still serves as an incredibly powerful model to help us understand the implications of our engagement with the planet, the use of the planet, our effect, what we do to landscapes around us on biodiversity and the sheer existence, future existence for our own human future generations of species. And that's what he brings together so powerfully in his book, Half Earth, with that half, of course, being the place, being that amount of land, or you could think of it as also part of the sea, that if we were to lose that much in different parts of the world, we would lose just too many species. We'd reach a point, a tipping point, if you will, and a point of no return potentially, of some critical functions lost for future generations.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit where our science comes in. So we are kind of building on these foundations that Ed and others laid, and then using new technologies, new tools to then say, well, obviously we're not going to carve up the world into half, and obviously that would be actually a silly thing to do biogeographically, because species, as you were setting up, Dennis and Piotr, are in different parts of the world. So the way we need to think about conservation, about decision-making, about management and trade-offs, and indeed triage, you're not going to be able to save every species going forward, is by developing that knowledge, that information base that allows us to make smart decisions, or at least not make them ignorantly, so that we know, well, where is a place, a pixel in this larger global picture that is particularly valuable, that if we were to lose, we'd go a particularly large step towards losing critical functions for future generations, critical biodiversity. And that is what the Half Earth map is about. It's filling in that pattern, filling in that picture.
Right, at a global scale, yeah. So thanks for that, Walter. You know, I think one of the things that comes up in this conversation, you know, so Gorongosa is in the book. Gorongosa is listed as one of the best places, one of the most important places, and you know, Peter obviously could talk at length about why that's so, and Walter, I'm sure, and Paula, you could name other places that meet these criteria. But, you know, there's a couple of words that in the project we often talk about. We talk about richness and rarity. And I think it might be useful for the audience to hear a little bit about that, because one of the ways I think about, one of the messages we don't want to send anybody is that you're sort of in a place where there isn't any need for conservation, or there isn't species that should be valued. And I'm wondering if you might have some comment in connection, maybe in connection with rarity, that you know, should tell us how we should think about biodiversity, maybe in our own neighborhoods, in our own regions. You want to start off, Walter? Walter, you're muted. Oh, still muted. Huh. I wonder if...
And now it worked.
Yeah,
okay,
there you
there
go.
was some technical glitch here.
Yeah.
I'd be happy to comment on that. So when Ed talks about richness in his book, it's pretty straightforward, actually. It's the count of species in a particular place, right? The more species on a larger island, you're going to find more bird species in Cuba than in Hispaniola or a small little island. And more species often means better, right? And greater diversity and greater benefits, more functions, but not necessarily so. Actually a small set of very specialized species with unique functions could be holding up could be those, if you look at birds, and it may not be that many, but they may be those really important nodes in this larger web of life, right? That's another way to think about it, perhaps a better way. We're not just counting things up. We need to think about them as nodes, and every bird relates to some insects that are prey. Some of those may be important for the agriculture in the area. Others may be actually potentially quite detrimental. So they're holding really important functions in that regard. And so one thing that biologists are now increasingly looking into is to work with functional diversity metrics. And that doesn't just apply to animals. You could think about it equally in plants, different plants providing different types of structure and different types of resources to the environment. So we need to think about that dimension as well. And I know Ed is thinking a lot about it right now as he's tackling his next book that he's calling Ecosystems.
Right.
So he's going from species to ecosystems. So just a little point on the side here. Now, there is something particularly important around endemism or rarity, the way we've been talking about it. And we're talking about just geographic rarity. If something is very restricted geographically, say restricted to a single island or a single mountaintop, then we call it very restricted or geographically rare, or we can call it endemic. It's endemic to that region, right? So if you, as a tourist, go there and you're a naturalist, then you tend to be after the endemic species, because those are the species you're not going to see anywhere else. So if you want to see them once in your lifetime, that would be your opportunity to see them. So that's what endemism and rarity is about. But there's a particular conservation component to that, in that if anything was to happen to those places that have a lot of endemic or restricted species, those would be those species would be gone for forever. In other places where we may have mostly common species that occur in many other parts of the world, a particular impact may not wipe out the species for forever. And we've been hearing about population losses of birds in North America. There was a big article a few months ago that some of you may have seen in the press, and this is all extremely disturbing, and we need to be mindful about these ecological losses that we are seeing. But I would say that nothing is as problematic and as impactful for future generations as the global loss of a species. So not a population decline, but a population decline that then leads to zero population size. And that's a global extinction. And those are occurring in those places where species are geographically rare or endemic. And some of those places, by the way, may be right around you. Some of you may be on from California. California has hundreds of plant species that occur nowhere else in the world but in California. A lot of the oak species in California wouldn't be occurring anywhere else. Others of us may be in the Northeast, like myself at Yale, and you may look around here, and all of this was covered by ice not that long ago during the ice ages. So there are not a lot of species that are particularly geographically rare, but you do get them. We were just up in a really neat part of Massachusetts last weekend, where you have this outcrop of a particular type of rock and soil that supports some of the greatest diversity of ferns in all of North America. And some of these are restricted to just a few places. And if something was to happen to them, they would also go globally extinct. So some of these stories are playing out right in our backyard. And if we didn't have land trusts or conservation organizations look after this, we'd be losing some of this diversity for forever. And that's very much the sort of thing that Ed is talking about in his book, and that we like to think about at the global scale, because they're backyards, like backdrops around people's livelihoods everywhere. And we're trying to support a better understanding of just the global significance of some of these places in the world.
If I may add one more thing to it, that there's another dimension to it. One thing is obviously the endemism and the risk of losing a species on a global scale if something happens to a particular spot that has a number of endemic species. There's also something known as a phyletic or phylogenetic rarity. Some of those species may represent lineages that have very, very few species. So there is another way of ranking the importance of places that need to be protected. And it very often happens that those species that are those places that are the greatest risk and are the most isolated, such as islands, for example, Madagascar, New Caledonia, will not only have high species diversity, but they will also have a number of endemic lineages that are unique on a global scale. So a loss of a single species may mean not just the loss of a species, but an entire lineage of life. If we were to use an example from, let's say North America, we have the world's greatest population of horseshoe crabs. Horseshoe crabs, they are thankfully still doing okay, although not as well as they should. But they are only one of the 4 species on the planet of horseshoe crabs. There are 3 more in Southeast Asia, which means that the US holds 25% of all the species of a lineage that goes back almost 500 million years. And if we were to lose those crabs, we would lose not only a quarter of the world's diversity of species, but also a quarter of an entire ancient lineage of organisms. If we were to lose kiwis in New Zealand, we would not only lose a species of a bird, we would lose an entire lineage of birds. So these lineages encapsulate not only ecological roles, but also a great deal of unique genetic information that it should be able to exist on its own inherent value, but also we would lose an insight into the history of life and part of our life history.
Yep.
So.
No, thanks so much for that addition. I want to one of the questions that we have from the audience from Chris is, what are some of the small things that each person can do? I just wanted to mention that now so that you can think about some things that you might recommend people to do. I think we'll get into that a little later in the conversation. But we also had a question from James, and he was asking about rewilding. And I think the heart of this question is a recognition that, we all imagine this planet we live on. We think about the space that humans have occupied, the way we're using the land, and can we set aside half of that? We've already mentioned a random half doesn't work, but I think it'd be worth talking a little bit about what are some of the things, and where do you see the sort of interpret for folks what rewilding means and what role that might play in the Half Earth Project efforts. Peter, maybe you could start with that.
Sure. It's rewilding. It's a very interesting concept, and on its surface, it sounds like this is what we should be doing. We should be rewilding, but we have to get to the definition of what it actually means, because there are different ways of understanding this concept. One of them, the most straightforward one, is simply bringing back as many components of the original ecosystem as they used to be before the disturbance caused by human activity. So, for example, we have this massive effort to rewild Europe now by helping the native original populations of organisms that used to live there by augmenting them by introducing individuals from other populations of the same species from a similar region, eliminating some of the factors that prevent species from flourishing, like reducing industrial activity, of agricultural activity, and so on, and that helps these original European ecosystem to bounce back and come back to a state that is fairly similar to what used to be there before the the human intervention. And then there's another concept of rewilding, which has gained some popularity in the US. Namely, that involves bringing back ecological components that no longer exist. So, for example, the area that is now the United States have its own cheetah, and camels and animals that simply do not exist in that part of the globe. Their loss has had obviously a cascading ecological effect. For example, in parts of the Americas, there are trees that can no longer reproduce sexually by seeds because they had to go through the gut of a large herbivore that would prime the seeds for sprouting. Now those herbivores no longer exist. So can we perhaps bring in an equivalent from some other part of the world, introduce it there, and help that tree? Same thing with with the prairies of the United States. One of the reasons why the pronghorn antelope is so incredibly fast, because it has evolved in the presence of very fast predators, the American cheetah. Having the cheetah there would, quote unquote, restore the composition of the ecosystem. But where do we bring the cheetah from? The only place we could bring it from is Africa. That's a different cheetah than what it used to be in the Americas. So we would have functionally, we would have an organism now. If we brought cheetahs to the United States, we would have something that is functionally similar to what it used to be there, 30,000 years ago or so. But it is actually it would be an exotic animals that no longer fits into that ecosystem. And there's of course all kinds of risks associated with bringing in organisms from different parts of the world. When you're bringing a cheetah, you're not bringing just a cheetah. You're bringing its internal parasites. You're bringing its own bacterial flora. You bring all kinds of things that we don't know what kind of effect it would have on the American ecosystem. So we have to separate those two concepts of the rewilding by essentially giving local nature a chance to bounce back, and this more invasive rewilding where we are actually bringing in elements from different parts of the world, trying to restore the ecological composition of that place as it used to be before even humans were present in that place.
Yeah. So we clearly have an audience that has studied up a little bit on our project. And so we have some questions I'd like to direct at Paula. And Paula, I'd like to, we have a question. So I think there's a couple of things where this will fit. So, someone wanted to know more about Microsoft's support for the project. There was also another question about the AZA, the Association of Zoos and Aquaria, and whether we might be partnering with them. And then, Daniel had sort of a general question also about, should biogeography be the new economy? So anyways, there's sort of like, I guess one thing is, how do we rally the economy and the business interests, and how is our thinking along those lines? If you try and give an answer to that very general question.
No, it's a really important question, because as we're all leaning forward towards this goal and solution for our planet, we're also raising our hands and saying, how do I fit in? And one of the most extraordinary things is that each of us, everyone on the phone here, as well as in society, does have unique expertise and experience they can lend to this. And thank you for your question. Microsoft has something that's truly valuable to our work, and that is a cloud space that allows us to do, or supports us to do, the extraordinarily huge data analytics that need to be done in order for us to really do the work that we're doing to create the half-Earth map and understand where we have the best opportunity to protect the most species. So that's where Microsoft comes in right now. They are actually an organization that is simply providing those cloud resources to us to allow us to be able to do that work, which is it creates an enormous amount of data. companies everywhere in some way have already begun to raise their hands and say, how can we be part of a half-Earth future? And in fact, last fall at Half-Earth Day, we launched a new initiative called Companies for a Half-Earth Future, because we were really interested in them telling us where they could use innovation to really drive mission, purpose-driven mission that drives value to our planet, as opposed to value to shareholders, as is the traditional model. And just extraordinary entrepreneurs and innovators really thinking in that space, raising their hand to be part of that conversation and provide models for us all on how in various sectors we can do more and better to drive towards a half-Earth future. It's interesting that someone also brought up AZA. AZA is a strong supporter. Their CEO, who used to also be head of the Fish and Wildlife Service, was a speaker at Half-Earth Day last year. And I consider AZA a place where there's another audience we can reach. Oftentimes we think of conservationists, people that are out in nature and hiking, and, but some families really only engage in nature through parks or through zoos and aquariums, grandparents taking their grandkids into those spaces. And so it becomes an opportunity for us to engage them with nature and educate them on the importance of these species, and sometimes even do research that helps us to foster the better livelihoods of animals in parks and in the field as well. So AZA in that sense becomes sort of a pillar community for a half-Earth future. They can provide leadership that helps us to draw together people around the idea of communities for a half-Earth future. And they also have scientists who are working in various ways to support a half-Earth future. And so I do consider AZA a good friend in that sense, and certainly aligned with and leaning forward in a way that supports the work of the Half-Earth Project. But remember, the Half-Earth is an umbrella, right? It's meant to be inclusive of everything everyone is doing everywhere to contribute to this goal and solution for our planet. And so it's specifically there to allow us to be inclusive and allow us all to feel we can contribute in whatever way we can towards this goal and solution.
That's great. Thank you, Paula. I'm sure we'll have more to say about some of these aspects of it. Again, this sophisticated group, there's been some discussion on the chat about corridors, and I think that it could be worth talking again. This is another example of what are the variety of things that sort of could get us to half. And I think it's represents a more sophisticated sort of network thinking about what protected areas look like. Walter, would you like to make some comment on corridors?
Sure, happy to, and happy to hear more questions that we could interactively address. And I put some responses there in the chat, by the way, and also links to resources in case you would like to check that out. As Ed already alludes to in his book, and as we certainly are all aware, as we think about half-Earth and think about actual solutions towards sustaining biodiversity for future generations, we obviously can't just think about parks. The days where you can just think about setting up a huge swath of land as a new park are mostly over, and they should be over, because we need to think more about engaging local communities, about essentially the larger socioeconomic setting of reserve design, but also of just alternative ways of sustaining species. So management areas for conservation, or the conservation of only particular species. So in some cases, what we're talking about in Half-Earth is not necessarily huge new parks or reserves. I think some of those, sustaining some of those great wild places of the world would be wonderful, seeing some more of those. But in many cases, we're talking about what Ed actually called a gerrymandering of reserves, if you will, or places that are seeing species put first and human users potentially put second, but not excluded. So as we think about conservation solutions, not just in North America, but also in some of the rapidly growing economies in the tropics, and we think about balancing the needs of nations, the needs of people, balancing the sustainable development goals around biodiversity with those around poverty alleviation, education, all of these other important needs. We need to think about smaller places. We need to think about best possible science and technology helping us identify those places and manage them, and thereby sustain those vital nodes in the web going forward. And that includes, sorry, that was a bit of a longer introduction, but I see those things ultimately intertwined. That includes these corridors, which are sometimes large, but often they're quite small, and they're about ensuring the connectivity of populations of species. And that applies to both plants and animals ultimately. So as we humans necessarily will be using a greater portion of the planet going forward, we can do so in an increasingly smart way. And that's where the Half-Earth Project map and a lot of other activities around the world are trying to put their best thinking in science and how can we identify those places and think not just about a place here and a place there, but think about the larger interconnected web, if you will, of places that will help us support species and important functions going forward. And this is something that we can't think about in just a current day way. We need to think about that with changing climate in mind. So what's called a climate smart or a climate adaptive conservation planning and corridor planning. So this is tricky business. There isn't a simple global map of the corridors that we need. That map will change as we have better biodiversity data and will change as we get more and better climate change projections. But this is a really, really important area of research that efforts such as the Half-Earth Project, as well as others out there are supporting.
Yeah. Well, Paula, you already alluded to you mentioned that we're sort of trying to be an umbrella. And I think there's general awareness that there's lots of efforts going on out there. And of course, the Half-Earth Project partners with a lot of different important organizations. We use data that's coming from all sorts of sources around the planet. I wonder if you might say something about what differentiates our, I think people have heard goals like 30 by 30. And I think it gets back to why Ed wrote this book in the first place. And I know my audiences of most of young people, for example, really respond to this call. Maybe you could comment on a little bit on that. Yeah,
sure. There are many targets that are presented, 30 by 30, 50 by 50. Half-Earth is a global goal. It's not driven by geopolitical boundaries, but by the science that guides what we must do for our whole planet. So inevitably, countries do need to establish priorities for conservation management, and targets that champion projects are a great way to do that, and an important step on the way to the Half-Earth goal. But 30% may not be the optimum number for some places, and dates established only by political will might not be soon enough for some species. What the Half-Earth Project is trying to do is to work to create a cutting-edge, data-rich decision-making tool, a Half-Earth map, as we've been discussing, to help us understand where we have the best opportunity to protect the most species and to engage people everywhere in action to protect these places.
Yep.
So that's a bit of the difference between the 30 by 30 or 50 by 50 kinds of goals and really what Half-Earth is talking about, a global goal for our entire planet.
Peter, do you have any observations along those lines?
Yes, yes, and I think Gorongosa is actually one of the better examples of how you have to be flexible in realizing these big conservation goals. We are an incredibly adaptable organization. Our approaches to conservation have to constantly evolve. And I want to mention something that also links to the previous point, namely the corridors. You know, when you look at map of Africa, map of Mozambique, there's this place, the central Mozambique, from Mount Gorongosa to the coast. We would love if this entire area were a national park. And so if you spoke to us, 10 years ago, that would have been our goal. But that's not realistic. You cannot simply tell people, you have to leave now, this is going to be a protected area. So we have to use some other approaches, and we have to be far more flexible in what strategies we use to protect the greatest amount of biodiversity in that area. So what we are trying to do now is to create a corridor that stretches for about 150 kilometers from the coast inland, and a corridor that will encompass all possible types of landscapes and ecosystems that can be found in this part of the world. Now, again, we cannot simply declare this is a protected area. We have to work with local communities. We have to work with the government, and we have to decide what is the best strategy that will satisfy both our requirements for conservation, but also will make this this conservancy beneficial to people who are already there. We will never be able, and we will never want to remove people or make life miserable for people who are already there. So we have to, for example, abandon certain plants. Okay, we would love to have that part be part of our conservancy, but this is an important part to the community. They traditionally, they've always grown whatever sorghum there. We cannot simply do that. So we have to find a different way. We have to find either a comparable place where we can instill a slightly stricter conservation rules, or we simply abandon that and we go somewhere else. But we're still trying to create a big corridor that connects, Mount Gorongosa to the mangroves on the coast. So just like with, all these other approaches, 30 by 30, 50 by 50, you have to be flexible, but you have to be driven towards that ultimate goal. On our look, again, I'm speaking from the perspective of this small pixel on the map of life. We want to create a corridor that will encompass and connect all possible types of landscapes in this part of the continent. And we have to use the same approach on the global scale. And we do that, again, by being flexible, being adaptable, but always keeping in mind two things. One, that we cannot do it alone. Whatever we do in terms of conservation has to be beneficial to people on the ground. And B, we will achieve that goal. We are realists, but we are optimists. And we know that sooner or later we will achieve that goal. And I think the same approach will work on the global scale, and we will achieve the half Earth goal. Maybe not in 2050, but we will.
Walter, do you have anything to add about? I know you're involved in so many of these targets, and various working groups. Do you have any comments about these goals?
Yeah, no, happy to chime in. And this is a very relevant discussion, not only because of Ed's birthday yesterday and his book, and obviously the fact that there's no time to lose here in saving species and thinking about how we could do that. It's also really a timely discussion because for example, the goals, the targets of the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is the big biodiversity convention, like we have a climate convention. You may have heard about the Paris Accord, right? That talked about the 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius decision. There is actually a same sort of convention for biodiversity. And the question is, well, what is it? How much area, how much biodiversity do we want to sustain going forward for future generations. Well over 150 governments signed up to that convention. Again, the US in its own separate status, not fully a signatory to that convention, but participating. So right now, these renegotiations are happening, and a key question is, going forward, how much area should each nation kind of put aside or prioritize for species, for biodiversity, for conservation? And increasingly, there is already a recognition that that doesn't just need to be formal reserves. It could be alternative management areas, and I think that's a good recognition. But we are still in these discussions, and there's a whole set of international policy, science policy interface discussions going on that I'm participating in some of those. There is still that thinking that, well, we're just going to settle on a number that then every nation should be trying to achieve, whether that be 18%, well, thankfully not anymore. That's what 17 or 18% was the recent target, the 2020 target, that we're now trying to go beyond and do better. But what is the right 2030 or 2050 target? And actually a key realization that comes out of Ed's book, ultimately, and that comes from putting species first rather than thinking about square kilometers first, is that it's not going to be the same amount of area in every part of the world. Say the Northeast here, there are some really important places that we need to protect, otherwise we may lose some species for forever. But the Northeast here in the US is not the same as, say, Mozambique, or as the Eastern Arc Mountains in Africa, or as some ridges in the Andes in South America, which may have hundreds or thousands of species restricted to just them. So we need to think about different numbers and efforts needed in different parts of the world. And as an international community, we need to think about mechanisms that could support that. Because we cannot expect that, as you said, Piotr, the Mozambique people just decide or are happy to put a good chunk of their land, of their territory aside for conservation for the greater good alone. And it is, however, a fact that they are global stewards of these important biological resources. It's these sorts of points and discussion elements that we'd like to bring into this larger international discussion, and that we are trying to work into some of these international agreements. And that's where I see the particular role of science and science policy, if you will, advocacy, and also engagement with businesses, by the way, that's inspired by Ed and the science of biogeography, the science of thinking about species in a geographic context in the changing world.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks. Well, thanks, Walter, for again mentioning the role that businesses might have. I'm wondering if, Paul, if you could elaborate a little bit more on what you think the role of businesses could be in contributing to this. You know, there's a bunch of things. There's private enterprise, but also a lot of the land out there is also private. So maybe you have a comment about, you know, companies for a half-Earth future?
Sure. I mean, it's interesting you bring up the conversation about private land. There are some amazing people doing private conservation and land trusts and places like that that are working to restore species. We probably don't track those as well as we should when we're counting how well we're doing as we try to get to half. But there is, I think, a mindset that's shifting amongst businesses and individuals around what we should value. And one of the things that Ed had said in the book Half-Earth that maybe goes against convention is that our impulse to do extraordinary technology is going to be a big part of how well we manage our global footprint, our individual and global footprint, and how well we're able to, as populations grow, really realistically, right, get to a half-Earth future, right? And so as companies for a half Earth future imagining better ways of slicing bread, of growing more vegetables with less water, with shorter distances for distribution, what they're really talking about is the foundation, the backbone of a sustainable society, a sustainable future. You can imagine and imagining like a sustainable future is hard, isn't it? If per capita consumption continues along with population growth, it seems logical that it will break our resolve for large scale conservation. And that's true, it might, but only if the components of our ecological footprints remain the same. If you consider the way we're increasingly being shaped by technology, it's likely that our footprint will evolve to be smaller. And particularly if we can be a voice for the way this is working to support our lives. As I said, Ed writes about this a little in the book, that the products that cost less to manufacture, that need less frequent repair and replacement, that give the highest performance with the least energy, will be the winners, right? And so with each innovation and technology, the internet, education, online access to information and insight, wherever you are in the world, it has the potential to yield more and better results with less per capita material and energy, and inevitably reduce the size of our ecological footprint, and then along with biodiversity conservation, really create a sustainable planet. So fostering that conversation with companies for a half Earth future is, I think, a really important part of the success of our conservation ambition as well.
Yeah, that's great, thank you. I have so here's sort of a general question. I'm trying to interpret a few things on the chat. You know, when I'm forced to choose, my favorite chapter of the book is chapter 2, which is that we need a biosphere. And I think that's kind of been implicit in what we've been talking about today. And I think some people are also thinking of the pandemic, and they're literally thinking about how do viruses fit into the biosphere? And is this partly, you know, is this part of the cost we're paying for living so out of balance? So I'm wondering if, you know, if any of the panelists have some comments about the benefits we get from a happy biosphere, and that we should, we tend to think of it a lot as costs. And in fact, the benefits we would yield are so, are potentially so big. Paula, do you want to start off with a comment about that, and then maybe you know, and then see if Walter or Peter want to weigh in?
I see Walter leaning forward.
Yeah, yeah.
Let Walter say something.
Okay, Walter, do you want to start off?
I see Mozambique is still awake as well, but okay, so I can jump in here. I was worried you would point at me right away, Dennis, leaving the easy ones, leaving the easy questions for me. And thanks for just moving it over, Paula. So this is not an easy question, right? And relating the biodiversity health of our planet to the ongoing pandemic, given the still limited understanding we have around it, how exactly it's come about, how it's playing out, is tricky business. And I'm not an epidemiologist. However, I could just follow up on some of the remarks that I made earlier around the important functions that species hold, right? That all species are nodes in a larger web, and you could think of the viruses in there as well, right? And they connect to others. They're facilities of your virus would be here. You have your host or disease vector, and then you have hosts that get impacted. And then you have a web around us that may be affecting the vectors, the hosts, or indeed engaged with disease directly. So there is no doubt that we still have a much too limited understanding of the role of species in the biosphere. As Piotr pointed out, we don't even know the existence of some of these species. And if you were to do the numbers properly, and you were really applied a proper discounting function going forward, I wouldn't be surprised, I'm actually certain, that future generations will point back at us and say, well, had they only found out about this a little bit earlier, had they only done a bit more basic and general discovery work in figuring out, well, this bat species, for example, is occurring in this part of the world, and actually it is a vector for this and that type of disease, and it does engage with other animals in this and that way, interact with them, and it does interact with humans in this and that way, as we consume it or we otherwise happen to be come in contact with it. I'm still at shock because we did a little side study here in Map of Life. We looked at how much data do we actually have for some of these species, some of these bat species in Asia, or indeed bat species globally. Bats are a really important host for a number of animal-borne diseases that can affect humans. How much do we actually know about them, where they are, exactly what they do? And for the Chinese species, we have, for some of these horseshoe bats, we have a couple of data points. For others, we have perhaps a dozen or two of where somebody recorded, well, I saw this species in this location, or there's a museum specimen somewhere that got, the label of which got digitized, and that information got shared and therefore is accessible to researchers. So I feel one way in which, one lesson that we should be taking out of this all is the importance of information that allows us to quickly react when something happens and appreciate which of these other, what the other nodes are that may be involved, and that allow us to better plan going forward. And the healthy biosphere does need, in some ways, it needs all of these nodes. Yes, we can continue to exist with some of these nodes impacted or perhaps not there anymore, but we better have an understanding of it so we can react and plan going forward. And that's sort of what I'm taking most strongly out of Ed's writings and the larger spirit that he's sharing with us.
Right. We don't know enough perhaps to choose like the most critical species. That's why we need to look at this richness and this rarity. We don't really know enough to be confident that we'd be making the right choices, it seems.
If I may very quickly make a point on the second chapter on the why we need the biosphere, and it goes to the concept of species richness. Now, how many times have you heard of a pest, devastating pests that completely decimated the Amazonian rainforest? Have you ever heard of such thing? No, you haven't. But you have heard of pests decimating monocultures. You know, every agricultural field, every pine plantation is susceptible to these events that cause incredible damage. And that's because we have removed the buffer effect of other organisms that should be in that ecosystem. So the richer the biosphere, the more species we have, the greater the buffering effect. And perhaps at some point in the future, again, Ed is busy now writing about it, about the science of ecosystem, but perhaps he will also reach the conclusion that maybe one of the reasons we are having the pandemic now and other outbreak of the diseases is not necessarily because we are encroaching on the ecosystem and getting closer to those organisms, which is probably true anyway, but because we have removed something and that was between us and those organisms that had a buffering effect. Perhaps there was a series of organisms that would cause the whatever pathogen there is that jumped directly from the primary carrier into us. Maybe we removed something that would have allowed that pathogen to spread out to other populations and never reached us. So essentially, the richer the biosphere, the lesser the risk of something of happening that has a global implication, that has this effect of wildfire spreading, because there are fewer barriers to the transmission of whatever, a pathogen or something along those lines. So you know, some of these things, again, we may never be able to put either a monetary or, you know, and some other economic value on, but we can very, very safely assume that the more organisms we have, the more complex our ecological networks are, the safer we are, because those networks will have, again, this buffering effect on the global ecosystem. So, you know, we need the biosphere, and we want that biosphere to be as rich as physically possible.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, really excellent point there, Peter. I think we're gonna start to wrap things up here. I did want to get to this question, and I know it's a really tough one. Rachel Ann is joining us back in, and I think she had a final question. I don't want to take a lot of time with this, and I know we all want to be careful about being overly prescriptive, but the question comes up so many times, what can I do? And I think people mean a lot of different things when they ask that question. So again, when I'm talking to students and teachers, I may say things like, you know, volunteer to get rid of invasive species, plant native species. You know, without trying to be prescriptive, I may recommend think about eating less meat. There's a variety of things like this. I'm just wondering if folks have any, you know, if you want to just make a couple of comments on things like that. And since you're up, Peter, do you have a quick, do you have anything you could,
Yes,
along those lines?
I do. I can tell you about my pet peeve, and that is the practice of keeping, you know, these disgusting green deserts in front of our houses, which we call lawns. You know, if we replace lawns with you know, beautiful communities of native vegetation, we are essentially adding pixels to this beautiful map, you know, of half Earth. We're increasing biodiversity. We are helping you know, sustain these local populations, local species, local ecosystems. So, you know, if I could get rid of all the lawns that often grow, you know, a single species of a grass, often an exotic species, if we could replace them with essentially local meadows, which first of all would be so much more beautiful, that would be a fantastic major stride towards, you know, towards half Earth, towards increasing the number of the amount of spaces that can be filled by native biodiversity.
That's terrific, Peter. And I know certainly in the United States, there's organizations that are devoted to that and can even help guide you if you're interested in doing that. Paula, do you have anything you'd like to say about what can I do?
Well, I was sitting here thinking about what Ed would say, and you know, he sometimes I don't get what he's saying in the moment, but he always turns out to be right. So it's worth listening to.
He has a good track record, yeah.
And the thing that he says over and over again, I saw this in an interview rereading an interview that he did the other day, was that really, you know, it's about expanding our values. It is about, in a way, creating an awareness around what Peter was just saying, kind of knowing that. Something about our inherent biophilia in this moment, I think, is particularly makes this appealing, that we are leaning forward and seeing the world in a different way that allows us to have that greater awareness of maybe what the effect of our lawn is or other things in our lives. But what Ed would say is that we have to know it. Knowing it, preserving it, studying it, understanding it, cherishing it, and just holding on until we know what the hell we're doing is sort of what Ed's asking you to do. And, you know, with great humility until then, you know, study, share, collaborate, and work together towards a real moonshot for our planet. I think that's what he would say.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate that, Paul. And that really resonates. I sometimes in education work, you get asked, and I'm like, what's nice about education is the call to action is learn something. Of course, then the next thing is, you know, understand it, communicate it, and share it. And I think that's super important.
Yeah, and we all know that whatever we're most passionate about turns out to be what we're most successful at. And so if we can kind of lean forward in that way, we probably could get there.
That's great.
I think.
Well, how about quickly, Walter? Anything quickly, Walter?
Walter, let me unmute you.
With Ed in mind, I would say, well, always have your magnifying lens along and be ready to pull it out to look at something, right? There's another one of Ed's great books is, or I would say, have your binoculars nearby. More partial to birds even than insects. But another great book of Ed's is The Naturalist, right? And I feel, if you haven't read it, I would highly encourage you to do so. And I feel in educating ourselves more and more about the nature around us, the species around us, the plants, the animals around us, and sharing that knowledge or sharing in that passion with others, whether that be our children, our relatives, our friends. The more we can ourselves and others connect with nature, I think the more we're all going to care about our planet. And that could be simply about realizing something it's there, or learning more about it, reading stories about it, which is increasingly easy now with not just field guides, but some of the apps and online ways of learning about things, or the species discovery tools that we discussed earlier, what's around me. But there are also additional ways of becoming a citizen scientist yourselves. It's not just that you can more easily discover things now with some of these tools, but you can also contribute your own data, your own observations, your images. So that's another a great way to engage, and not just on your backyard, which is ground zero. I agree with Piotr, but also as you travel to new places, be an ecotourist, not just by staying at an eco lodge, but actually doing activities that help you learn more about the species there, and perhaps support people that look after those species and take you to places to see them and learn about them, and thereby get an incentive an economic incentive to protect them going forward. So we shouldn't underestimate that as an important way in supporting Have Earth.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much. Thank you all for those thoughts and contributions. And Rachel Ann, I'll turn it over to you. People have been very patient. We continue to have some great questions. But yeah, thanks, everybody.
It's so fascinating. And as you guys were talking about rewilding in our own backyards, you know, I'm here in California, and every year my backyard just grows some different, I don't even plant things, because all of a sudden all of my pots and all of the yard things just start to come up, and every year they're different, and every year something else is sprouting out of a plant. So it's really interesting just to look around my own environment and notice all the diversity that's just occurring naturally. So it's very, very cool. And I hope that all of you at home get to see those types of things when you're out in your daily life and really looking at the environment. One of the questions I did have is the difference between conservation and repurposing. So there's a lot of movements right now about taking open plots of lands in cities and turning them into community gardens. And there's a lot of movements in smaller communities to take front yards and backyards and make them purposeful, and growing food and all these types of things. So do you feel that that can be as effective as conservation, where there's that second piece of this about, you know, changing the purpose of some of the spaces and how we use them in our daily lives and our cities? So that's for Walter or Paula or Peter or Dennis, whoever would like to speak to how repurposing the land is also part of conservation.
Well, I would say, of course. And part of it is because people be leaning in just the way Walter just said, connecting with nature in whatever way they can, which inevitably instills sort of, I think, a transcendent opportunity to make a difference in the world. But those gardens or planting also then become corridors, right, for butterflies and wildlife, to have a toehold here and there throughout a city or a place. Walter, what were you going to say?
Yeah, no, I agree that sort of that compound effect that over the years and a number of people that happens just through making an engagement with nature easier, whether that be, we talked about zoos and parks earlier, we talked about botanical gardens, we talked about here other ways of bringing nature closer to people. I think sometimes I wonder whether that may not be the most impactful way to actually make a difference, because then the more people then use that in their decision making, how they vote, what they do in their lives, how they go about, could be perhaps some of the greatest impacts that we're even having as a project, even though I may get most excited about a particular research result identifying a particular place as important. Then I would broaden it, perhaps Rachel, also to include not just going beyond repurposing, include this issue of restoration at large. I think if I can broaden it for just a moment, restoration is inevitably going to be necessary if we want to sustain the biodiversity that's on this planet for future generations above a certain background extinction rate that would happen anyway. Because we already have impacted a lot of land, a lot of oceans, and if we want to ensure the survival of species, ensure we have those corridors that we talked about earlier, it's not just a question of identifying primary habitat, but also doing some things that restore or make habitable again in some form human landscapes for species, and include humans in that equation very much for both education and exposure and just human health purposes, as well as conservation purposes.
Yeah, I mean, the only thought I have to add a little bit to that is to totally amplify what Walter's saying, and the fact that so many of us live in urban and suburban environments, which also resonates with what Peter was saying about lawns, and that this is where most of us live, and we really need to think about how we're living with nature in these places, even if they're not, you know, the sorts of places that we might set aside as conservation reserves. It's where we're living, it's where we're experiencing these things, and so it's really important. The sort of urban biodiversity is an important element of the way everyone's thinking about these things.
Plus,
I'm sorry, go ahead, Peter.
No, I just want to make a small comment that for, you know, every quarter of an acre that is repurposed and used to grow whatever, cabbage or potatoes in an urban setting, is a quarter acre that does not have to be cleared somewhere that is, you know, in a natural area. So every you know, piece of land that we can cover with chlorophyll matters.
Yeah, that's
great. The grow food, not lawns movement. I'm a big fan of. Yeah, this has been really incredible to read and get a chance to learn from all of you. And there's a lot of things that we all can do in our daily lives through education and awareness and outreach and togetherness. So I would highly recommend continuing to stay in touch with the Half Earth Project and their website and what they're doing, and tell your friends about what they're doing, tell your educators about what they're doing, and your teacher friends. And you know, the more that we can make people aware that there are ideas out there and there are solutions out there, and that there are people and organizations really trying to solve these complex problems that we all face together. It's comforting, you know, to be honest. You know, if there was no one looking out there for these solutions or trying to figure out how to save our planet, that would be a lot scarier. So it's nice to know that there's out there. And one of the reasons that we chose this book, and for many of you that know Mickey's background, he has had the opportunity in his life to meet incredible luminaries, and Dr. Wilson has always been at the top of his list. So before we leave, you know, obviously I would like to thank all of you from the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation for joining us. I would like to thank all of you that tuned in for all of our book club meetings. I recognize some of you here in the Zoom, so thank you for reading. And what great questions today. We will put some of the questions in the chat, and we will also post this recording to Facebook. So this way, if you'd like to share it with anyone that you think would be interested in, it will be live in a couple days. We'll share it in the news feed. But I want to just close this out with what Mickey said about his time with Dr. Wilson. because I think it's really relevant and perfect for today. So he said, "My time with Dr. Wilson brought me to a revelation that our destruction of this planet is entirely arrhythmic, the opposite of creation. We have lost our groove, lost our place in the grand musical composition called life. And it's organizations like yours, Paula and Dennis and Peter and Walter and Chris, that are helping us get our groove back. So I really appreciate all of the hard work. Thank you so much for trying to save our planet. And I hope that we will all do our part to support your work, because this is definitely a team effort."
Thank you so much, Rachel Ann.
And if you have any last minute questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and you can visit the website for more answers. The contact information for reaching out to any of our panelists are on the website. They're very responsive, and like I said, it's been my pleasure to host these book club meetings, and I hope together we all get to move forward.
Thank you, Rachel Ann, and thank you very much to everyone who joined us in this conversation today. I look forward to continuing it with all of you.
Goodbye, everyone. Have a fantastic day and the rest of your weekend.
Thank you.